Thank you for joining us. As we mentioned earlier, continue to introduce yourself in the chat. But to start off, I'll just hand it over to our Executive Director, Peggy Shepard, to give opening remarks. Welcome, Peggy.
So good morning and good afternoon to all of those of you who've joined us today. I'm Peggy Shepard, Executive Director and co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice. And we are excited today to host a panel discussion on driving down pollution from the transportation sector. For many years, We Act has fought for clean transportation policies that improve air quality and health for environmental justice communities across New York, those communities that are overburdened by diesel pollution from trucks and buses. Now, our Old Dirty Diesel campaign led the Metropolitan Transportation Authority to invest in cleaner buses, resulting in 95% reductions in tailpipe emissions citywide. More recently, we successfully passed Intro 455, which is a law that requires school buses serving New York City public schools to be all electric by 2035. Now, in light of upcoming federal rulemaking for heavy-duty vehicles, today's panel discussion will explore state and federal policies and actions that will realize significant emissions reductions and health improvements in environmental justice communities, while also ensuring a just and equitable transition towards transportation electrification. I now have the honor of introducing our moderator for today's event, Dr. Regan Patterson. Dr. Patterson is currently the Transportation Equity Research Fellow for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She is an environmental engineer and researcher with a focus on environmental justice, transportation equity, and air quality, and she has worked with various environmental justice organizations and government agencies in California. So please welcome Dr. Patterson.
Thank you, Peggy, for the kind introduction, and I so appreciate the invitation to moderate today's panel. It is a pleasure to be here among such esteemed panelists who I have the pleasure of now introducing. So I would like to turn it over actually to our esteemed panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share their expertise on this important topic by starting off with the question, what does their organization do to reduce transportation pollution? And for our first panelist, I would like him to answer, tell us about the research you've done. So first, let us hear from Dr. Julian Marshall, Associate Chair for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Climate, and Professor of Civil and Environment Engineering at the University of Washington. So Dr. Marshall, if you could tell us about yourself and tell us about the research you've done around the unequal exposure and health impacts of transportation pollution.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Regan and Peggy, for this invitation to be here. I'm glad to be here. I noticed from the people who have joined, there are many experts on this topic in the audience. So thank you to them also for being here. Yeah, I'm a professor at the University of Washington studying inequalities in exposure to air pollution. And I think a few observations that might help frame today's conversation. When we look at exposure to air pollution, including transportation air pollution, a few things we see. Number one is that disparities are larger by race than by income. And that's a result that surprises some people and does not surprise other people at all. That's something that we see in our research and other people have found as well. The second thing is when we look over time at what's happened to air pollution, especially transportation emissions, but we see the concentrations have come down over time and everybody benefits from that. That's the good news. But we also see kind of structural inequalities that are locked in place. And even as the air gets cleaner, you still have some communities that are more exposed than other communities to the now cleaner air. And so what that says is if we keep addressing air pollution in the future in the way that we have been in the past, we'll probably continue to do the same thing we've been doing, which is to improve the air, which is good, but also maintain structural inequalities, which we want to not continue. And the last thing to mention is, of course, when we look at the inequalities that we see today in air pollution exposure, we can connect them directly not only to decisions that are happening today and in a modern context, but also to decisions from many decades ago, the race-based planning that led to many aspects of our urban infrastructure and where people live. And that's especially true for transportation, of course. Where the highways were placed, it's a major part of the legacy of racist planning that we have. And so that influences the disparities in exposure today to transportation emissions. So I will stop there. Look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for those grounding comments to help frame this conversation. And I'm glad you're able to join us today. Until now, let's turn it to Margaret Ogay, former director of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at the EPA and board chair of the International Council on Clean Transportation. So if you can introduce yourself and briefly tell us what your organization does to reduce transportation pollution.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Good morning, and I guess good afternoon for the ones in the East Coast. I spent most of my career at the Environmental Protection Agency, almost 20 years, setting standards and policies to reduce emissions from all transportation sources, from cars, trucks, airplanes, and so forth. Just for the audience, it was December of 2000 that President Clinton established this diesel, clean diesel, what we call clean diesel fuel program that went into effect in 2004 and fully implemented in 2010. And this was a great program. At the time, we were all, impressed that President Bush came to the office, and this was the only regulatory program under President Clinton that allowed to move forward because of Governor Whitman, the former, governor of New Jersey. And, what happened with this program, for the first time, we introduced catalysts to diesel trucks. This was never the case before. Cars, we introduced catalysts back in the 1970s, but for diesel trucks and buses, we didn't have any emission control systems. So as a result, over 8,000 premature deaths were prevented, millions of respiratory illnesses. And as the previous, Julian said, overall, the country benefited. But we have seen now, study after study, and more important, millions of the dirtiest, oldest polluting engines and vehicles to be in areas where people of color and people of low income live, around ports, around highways, rails, and so forth. So I think, in my view, there is a great opportunity that President Biden has the White House, states, local governments, and the federal EPA to fix this problem. It's about time that we take a step to revise those existing standards that have provided a lot of benefits across the board, but I think the agency can do more, and I will be glad to speak. As far as what I'm doing currently, I'm wearing many different hats. Overall, I'm an advisor to boards for foundations, environmental groups, and governments, and continue to wake up every morning and say, what I'm going to do today to cause some trouble so we can save more lives. Again, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to your perspective on this panel. And next we have Bob Dean, CEO of the Center for Neighborhood Technology.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Dean. I'm the CEO of CNT, or the Center for Neighborhood Technology. We're a nonprofit organization that works on climate, transportation equity, environmental justice, and affordable housing, all topics where equity and sustainability come together in the built environment of our cities and our communities. So we bring together innovative analytics on these topics in the service of the priority of community-based organizations. So we uncover disparities and then work with community groups to help them design solutions to the problems that they face. CNT is based in Chicago, but works with local governments and community-based organizations across the country. And we're honored to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Great to have you with us, Bob. And up next, we welcome Roman Partida Lopez, Legal Counsel at the Legal Counsel for Transportation Equity at Green Lighting Institute. Roman?
Thank you. Morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Roman Partida Lopez with the Green Lighting Institute. The Green Lighting Institute is a racial and economic equity advocacy organization working to redress the impacts of redlining on low-income communities of color. We do this work through multiple fronts, through our work on climate equity as well as economic equity. As I mentioned, I'm the Transportation Equity Legal Counsel, and our work is really focused on reducing poverty and pollution in low-income communities of color. How do we make sure that we are uplifting and addressing the concerns of our communities, and that is being reflected in the policies, programs, and rulemakings that the state and local governments pass. So our work over the last few years has been really focused on that. How do we pass more policies and programs that are providing direct benefits to low-income communities of color? How are state and local agencies making equity real? And not just by having language that addresses equity, but actually seeing that in practice and making sure that these policies and programs are prioritizing low-income communities of color, frontline communities, environmental justice communities, disadvantaged communities. We know there's multiple names out there for our communities, but we know that the communities that are hit first and hardest are the ones who need the biggest support. So how do we making sure that these policies and programs are reflecting that? And so our work has been focused on that. And we do that both, again, working at the state level, but then also working at the local level with community partners and ensuring that their needs and priorities are reflected in policies and and both state policies, but also local programs. Thank you for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, it's so great to have you. The Green Lining Institute has inspired some of my own work, so it'll definitely be great to hear from you today. And last, but certainly not least, we get to hear from Angelo Logan, Campaign Director of the Moving Forward Network.
Thank you, Dr. Pedersen. So I'm Angelo Logan. I'm with the Moving Forward Network. And the Moving Forward Network is a coalition of 55 plus organizations in 20 cities across the country. We are made up of frontline community-based organizations, three mainstream organizations, and 12 academic partners. We mainly focus on freight transportation. That's the movement of goods through trucks, trains, marine vessels, cargo handling equipment, rail yards, freight corridors, warehouses across the country. So communities in and around seaports, inland ports, and everything in between. And we are a coalition that's frontline led. So our main goal really is to help to foster and build local power to realize local solutions on the issues that we're working on. We've launched our Zero Emissions Now campaign in 2015, really looking at all the categories across the freight sector. And in just last year, in October, we relaunched a very similar campaign focusing on EPA, really looking at all the categories and programs that will reduce and eliminate diesel pollution and work towards environmental justice and climate justice in frontline communities. I'll just say, although our campaign is focused on electrifying and transitioning to zero emission, we don't believe that zero emissions in of itself will achieve environmental justice, but is a major component to getting there. So as we work with local communities to help build that power to implement local solutions, we're also connecting the dots across the different cities and states and regions to really harness that to focus not just on the local solutions and local jurisdictions, but also the national jurisdictions like EPA. And so we're really eager to engage in this upcoming heavy-duty truck and bus rule, as well as other categories like locomotives, marine vessels, cargo handling equipment, and warehousing. And excited to be on this panel and engage in dialogue with you all. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad you're able to join us today as well. As our audience can see, we have such a diverse panel. And so I'm so excited to have these knowledgeable experts here today with us and to bring these various perspectives. So with that, we're going to get our conversation going. And so this event will be a panel discussion. And we have some prepared questions for our panelists to really get this going. But then we will definitely open it up for questions from our audience. So please feel free to submit questions throughout the event using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we have WEACT staff here who will monitor the chat so that we can get to those after our prepared questions. And so I'll begin with a question directed towards Julian, Angelo, and Roman. So first, Julian, given your research, how are trucks impacting communities of color?
Well, there are a number of health effects of air pollution. Of course, some of them are short-term and acute, things like asthma attacks. Some are longer term. We see exacerbation of chronic diseases, so heart attacks, lung cancer, something called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. There are a number of health effects of air pollution that are measurable, and that burden is, of course, not spread out equally.
Thank you. And Angelo, Roman, from your insights on the ground, working with local communities, how are trucks impacting communities of color?
Yeah, I'll just say from both my experience working with communities across the country in and around truck corridors, and also experiencing those impacts myself personally, living just downwind from the, one of the largest port complexes in the United States, the Port of LA and Long Beach. Trucks have the impacts are multidimensional. The number one issue for our communities are that, when you're exposed to high concentration of trucks, you're exposed to high concentration of diesel and air pollution, and that creates just an immense health impact. As the Dr. Marshall mentioned, respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular, low birth weight. But when you can't breathe, you can't do anything else, right? So it has an impact on your education, it has an impact on your family's income, and it just has a general impact on your everyday quality of life. When your family members or communities are suffering and maybe having respiratory illnesses, the quality of life diminishes when you have to spend most of your time in and around hospitals or caring for your loved ones. A local doctor in the LA area coined this term diesel death zone in and around port complexes because of the amount of children and adults that were visiting the ER because of respiratory illnesses due to exposure to truck pollution ultimately. And so I'll just say that the impacts are immense, and we really need to kind of figure out how we address this. I think the technology is available. It's feasible to start transitioning to zero emission. It really is about the political will and ability for us to come together to think of innovative approaches. But I'll just say that the impacts, and I can't overemphasize how severe they are in communities.
Yes, and I really appreciate you connecting it. So often we think of the health, but how that really impacts the day-to-day experience. And so thank you for tying that to this as well. Roman?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is Angela, I think, covered it really well on those impacts on our local communities, our frontline, our portside communities, right, who live next door to ports and warehouses where you see a high number of trucks and buses operating on a daily basis, both from a health impact, right, but then also from even a congestion impact, right? They're the ones who have to deal with all these trucks and buses and others coming in and out of mostly trucks coming out of their communities, right? And so that really elevates the health impacts that they feel. But again, it's intersectional, right? Because there's definitely other components that are impacting our communities. And the only thing I want to add here is I think, we know that these impacts are happening. We know the impact that trucks are having on our local communities, yet at the pace that we move, that agencies move to address these issues is relatively slow. Many times we continue to hear, oh, we need to see the data, we need to see the data. And that data comes years later only to again address the issue that has already been identified by the community. And by then we've lost several years. So I think as we have this conversation today and we think about the impacts of EPA and the efforts that they do, how can we expedite that process? Because our communities are living a day in and day out and have that lived experience. And that should really also, and that in itself should be enough to help us move and prioritize these investments and policies to make sure that we're addressing these impacts in our low-income communities of color.
Absolutely. I'm like trying not to shake my head too much. I'm like, I can't shake the whole time. But absolutely. And something before I turn to the next question that you really segue nicely into is this emphasis on what is valid data and whose data is sufficient to move that needle. And so thank you so much for raising that point. And then to your next point around government moving slower than how we experience the impacts, I turn first to Margot to answer, given your EPA experience, What is the best pathway to achieve emission reductions and protect the lives of overburdened communities? So what kind of policies or legislation will achieve these emission reductions? And in answering, if you can also speak to this kind of time difference between experience and government action.
Unmute myself. Okay. Well, there are tremendous opportunities, both congressional when it comes to appropriation bills, the Build Back Better, state efforts, and EPA efforts, and local efforts. But let me mention a couple of areas that I'm concerned about. We all celebrated the over $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And this is fantastic. It's going to help, hopefully, to make the right decisions so we can put electric chargers in the right communities. There is a lot happening. However, there is a significant amount of money, and I think it's over $270 billion that is going to the states to spend in highways. And the biggest concern that I have is, well, guess what? More roads, more pollution. So I think the state of Colorado is the first state that has decided to move forward and have a piece of legislation trying to redirect some of these resources from going from highways, expanding or fixing highways, to climate change. There is an existing provision in the Clean Air Act, the 1990 Clean Air Act, that's called the Transportation Conformity, that in the past has been utilized by some advocates, but most of them are at the national level. Please don't take this statement that I'm going to make as empirical data, but given what has happened with highway expansions, the freeway, I moved to California, Ventura County, very close to Los Angeles, and I think Angelo mentioned we have two huge ports. 15,000 trucks a day are moving around that area. So when we expanded all these freeways, what happened to air pollution? What happened to considering air pollution, where people live, the impact, and it's not just respiratory illnesses. People die. I mean, PM and NOx kill people. I mean, it's just pretty simple as that. So I think that is important for the advocates and the participants in this discussion to work with state officials to make sure that there's over $300 billion that will go in the next 5 years to highways are not going to cause even worse problems. The others that I want to mention, unfortunately, what is happening in many of the communities, low income and around ports and railroads, is that we have the older, most polluting trucks. So the question then is, what type of policies and resources we can put in place to replace these like drainage tracks, that are all over the ports. Again, there is a federal program under the Environmental Protection Agency. Many of you may know about it. It passed in 2005, and it's called the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act. And we use this provision, there are about $40 million, and I think President Biden added another $60 billion to replace the older, most polluted diesel engines with newer diesel engines. I think this program should be set aside. The majority of those resources, even Congress would put more resources to replace these older, more polluted, trucks with zero emitting vehicles, which we know they are available and will be more available in the future years. So instead of just waiting for the federal programs to take place, the state of California program to take place, I think there are, in my view, strategies that need to be brought together to start replacing these existing high polluting diesel engines in the communities around low income and communities of color. And then I'll come back for EPA, what EPA should do with my next question.
Okay, we'll come back. Yes, and so you do raise a great point around DERA funding and how that funding is available in the targeting of investments to communities. And so I thank you for raising that, the specific targeting. And so Bob, I turn to you. Margot kind of segued to the state and local actions. And so what would you say are things that can be done now or things that can be done to achieve emission reduction?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we think about it is that we need to consider action at multiple levels of government. So CNT as an organization usually works with at the local level with cities and community-based organizations. So air quality and truck standards regulations are housed with the federal and state governments. So directly regulating the standards of vehicles is largely outside the control of governments, but that doesn't mean that cities are powerless at all. They do decide through tools like zoning and permitting what uses can go where. So what we've seen in Chicago, our home city, is there's first of all a lot of freight-related development. Chicago is the freight crossroads of the country. LA and Long Beach obviously have a lot with the ports, but much stuff passes through Chicago, and so we have enormous amounts of truck and rail traffic. And what we've seen is a generally permissive approach by cities in our region to where warehouse and transportation and logistics businesses can go. So they've gotten very concentrated in just a small number of neighborhoods. And based on the history of environmental injustice in our country, you can pretty easily guess what these neighborhoods look like. They are largely lower income Black and Latino communities, the highest concentration on the southwest side of the city of Chicago. That particular piece of the problem where warehouses and intermodals and businesses like them locate is totally up to local governments. And so is the site design of these businesses about how they actually design their physical space and how it intersects with the neighborhood. So is the management of the streets leading up to these businesses. So these are all ways that cities can influence trucks and can influence how they behave. Also, clean air is partly about regulation, but not entirely. As Margot had mentioned, there's also investment, there's incentives, there's a lot of ways that government can not only through regulation, but also through the spending of money, determine what goes where and determine what kind of solutions are possible. So as we're having this conversation, our point is we just need to think broadly about the roles that different levels of government can play. There's clearly a federal role that's very important, but also a state one, and also roles that are in cities and even at the community-based organizations that operate in the most impacted.
Thank you. And speaking of multiple levels of government, and also particularly around the point, Margot, you raised around this huge infrastructure bill where funding has started to flow, I turn to you, Roman and Angelo, to speak more to what policies, legislation, executive actions will achieve emissions reductions. And if you could speak from your organizing and also translating these federal dollars into how they're being translated into environmental justice and injustice, as Margot noted with the highway expansion.
I'll follow you, Roman.
Yeah, thank you, Angelo. Yeah, I mean, I think, as we think about, these federal policies and then how they relate to local and even just state efforts, one of the things that we've been really focused on, and I forgot to mention at the beginning that the Greenlanding Institute is based in California, based in Oakland, California, and I'm actually down in San Diego. But one of the things that we've been really trying to do is how do we prepare state governments to apply for this funding, right? Some of these agencies or some of these state governments or state agencies already have some programs in place that are moving the needle on the transition to zero emission technology. However, that's not the case for all states, right? And even in California, there's still more work to be done. And especially as we think about how we're prioritizing equity within these programs. The California Air Resources Board, for example, already has in itself a set of incentive programs that's targeting and that's supporting this transition, right? And a certain percentage of that funding is going to projects in low-income or disadvantaged communities, as they're called here in California, based on that Cal Enviro screen. However, it's not all the funding, right? It's only it is a significant amount, but not the entire funding. But we know where we're going to see the most significant impacts are in our by transitioning these vehicles in disadvantaged communities. So one, how are we prepping that? But two, I think, and most importantly, is how are we elevating the community needs and priorities to then be able to be what's funded, right? And what state agencies are prioritizing for the state funds. funds. For accessing the federal funds. So I think there's that piece that's really critical that we need to start making the connection and prepping for the federal funding as it comes. And then, I think just as we think about at the federal level, just real quick, I mentioned equity and how that is being defined, right? I think even right now, as we see some of the tools starting to come out, there's a gap, right? There's a gap in what we identify as a low-income community of color, a disadvantaged community, and what the federal government is identifying, right? In much broader terms, creating more access, quote unquote. But I think what we need to do is really hone in and prioritize areas where we know these investments will make a direct and meaningful impact.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo all of what Roman said and some of the earlier comments about focusing in on, making sure that we are investing the monies that are public dollars into where we can get the biggest bang for our buck, especially focusing in and prioritizing EJ communities, right? Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, so that we can do the most good with those monies. We mentioned the amount of money that is going to be rolling out, and it is an enormous amount of money. But when it comes down to the amount of work that we need to accomplish, it really isn't as much as we really need. So there are limited dollars. And so when we're talking about limited dollars, we need to make sure that we're using them where we can get the best, results. And we believe that one, because of just generally morally, it's the right thing to do, right? That we need to make sure that we're lifting up working class, working poor communities of color that are impacted the most because of heavy duty transportation. And then also because we're investing in these neighborhoods, these are the most impacted neighborhoods. We're going to get a significant reduction by starting very local, right? And so then we'll get, larger impacts and benefits out of it. And so we need to make sure that we're investing in these places. Also, they're strategic because these are places where, the movement of goods happens through, let's say, for instance, drayage trucks. These are short haul trucks that are moving goods from the port to warehousing, within a couple hundred miles or so. So it's the most kind of feasible and practical place to start investing in zero emission technology. And then to that point around zero emission technology, we need to make sure that we are only investing these limited dollars into zero emission technology, not quote unquote clean diesel technology, not quote unquote, natural gas or near zero emission technology, but zero emission technology, true zero emission tailpipe trucks. And then I would say in terms of the public dollars, right, for public good, we need to make sure that we are not investing in companies that are in violation of labor laws, for instance, right, that are exploiting their drivers, that we're not giving public dollars so that a company can exploit their drivers, who tend to be our folks as well, folks in EJ communities that are impacted the most. And then also looking at the expenditures around the infrastructure, making sure that we're doing that right, that the public in the EJ communities have access to the charging infrastructure, and to make sure that that the folks that are, again, the most impacted have the most benefit and have access to the jobs in kind of building out the infrastructure, the equipment, and maintaining it and operating it.
Thank you. Yes, you highlighted so many different things. And so Roman and Angelo, speaking of the tools, speaking of knowing where to invest and targeting investment, considerations of labor. And so after these comments, Margaret, I turn to you. Based on your EPA experience, what should the EPA consider to strengthen the heavy duty trucks rules and indirecting, I'll add, and indirecting these funds?
So we're waiting for EPA to, any day now, to come out with what we call the NOx proposal. This will replace the existing program that was fully implemented in 2010, I believe. And as all of you know, California has taken steps to address NOx, starting as early as 2024. However, EPA, because of the Clean Air Act requirements, they have to give lead time to the industry for 4 years. So the NOx new standards will not apply until 2027. I just want to make sure that we all realize that. So we're expecting EPA to come out with this proposal. My hope is that along with NOx, EPA is going to propose ambitious greenhouse gas standards. Now, not a year from now or 2 years from now. And the reason I'm saying that is, and I'll come back to my views, that not only the country, the general country is going to benefit from multi-pollutant proposal that includes greenhouse gas standards, but also the industry that is regulated needs certainty. What they're going to do coming 2027. What is EPA going to require them to do? Instead of EPA coming back a year from now, or 2 years from now, or in 2024 when there is a presidential election, and say, by the way, this is what diesel truck manufacturers we want you to do. So I'm very hopeful that they will hear to what many of us are saying and come forward with an ambitious greenhouse gas truck standard. I believe, based on extensive data that I have seen, that by 2030, new diesel trucks, up to 30% of them could be zero emitting. It could be electric, it could be fuel cell, but it will have zero tailpipe emissions. And there are 4 reasons that I believe it can be done. The first reason is that the battery cost, because of the work that has been going on with personal vehicles, has come down over 85%. There is a recent industry study was done by Rouse Engineering. This is a technical engineering firm that supports the industry. So you listen to them a little bit more than consulting companies that only support NGOs. And their conclusion was that by 2027, as early as 2027, many of the medium and heavy duty trucks, like school buses, transit buses, urban delivery, drainage trucks, refuse trucks, will have lower cost of operations than diesel trucks. So we know that the technology is there, the cost is coming down, and the industry is ready. The second reason is that the industry is investing. Most of these companies are global companies. Volvo doesn't just operate in the US, operates globally. Europe is in the process of doing something extraordinarily strong when it comes to greenhouse gases and NOx for trucks. Daimler is the same company. Navistar now is owned by Volkswagen, and Volkswagen is a global company. So these companies are investing on the technology. The third reason is that the fleets realize that electrification is the way to go, not just only because they're going to reduce pollution, but because it makes economic sense. The cost of diesel and maintenance is the highest cost, along with the drivers. So we have seen fleet after fleet, from Walmart to FedEx to UPS, unfortunately not our post office, moving forward, putting the orders for replacing diesel trucks. And finally, the states are moving forward. California is moving forward. I believe 13 other states, representing maybe at least 30% of truck sales in the US, have signed a memorandum of understanding to adopt the California programs. The last thing that the industry wants to do is to have a state-by-state vehicle. So I think it encourages the federal government to set ambitious greenhouse gas and NOx standards with this proposal.
Thank you. And now I turn to Julian with the same question. What should the EPA, from your perspective, do to when considering the heavy duty truck rule?
Thanks. I really just appreciate and agree with all the comments that came before me. Those are all really, really important considerations. The 2 things that come to my mind, one is, of course, that trucks have a long lifetime. Heavy duty trucks last for a while. And so some implications of that are, you want your emission standards to last over time. It's not just a standard for what happens today, but what happens after 100,000 miles or 500,000 miles. Of course, as Angelo would point out, if it's an electric vehicle, then that kind of comes along with it. That's only a concern if you have sort of a low emission standard. It also means, as Margaret said, we want to focus on the older, dirtier trucks which emit a disproportionate amount of emissions. If we can kind of get those off the road sooner, that does disproportionate benefit. And then the second thing is, heavy duty trucks drive in many different environments. And for the kind of conversation we're having today, it's important to focus on the urban emissions, which will tend to be the short haul trucks as opposed to the long haul trucks that are spending most of their time in predominantly rural or remote locations. So that would include drayage trucks, as Angelo mentioned, which kind of go from a port to the warehouse it's going to. That might be 5 or 10 or 30 miles away. It would also include buses, school buses, and public buses, which some people have commented on before. Those have the advantage that in addition to improving the general environment, you're also improving typically the indoor environment as well for the kids that are riding on the school buses or the adults, whoever's riding on the public buses as well. So the focus there on kind of urban and short haul aspects of heavy duty emissions.
Great, thank you. And something that has been reflected in multiple answers is this need to focus on the high emitters. And so really focusing on getting these high emitters off the road to have greater impact. So thank you. And so next I turn to Bob first to speak about, you touched upon earlier, but what are some best practices or good examples of state and city policies? And so even as Margot and Julian talked about federal policies, there's been emphasis on what the states have been doing. So what are some good examples of states? And so Bob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So we're always hearing great ideas from California that don't translate to other states. So we're always hearing about what is CARB up to these days. And it's just, to us, it's like hearing about a foreign country. You can't do any of the stuff that California does in many ways, but there are a lot of things I think that even other states and cities can do. And I'm gonna focus on the city scale answer here. So in Chicago, we're really excited about the potential for cumulative impacts ordinance, which is essentially, it identifies parts of the city that are already overburdened by health disparities, and then it can restrict additional polluting development and puts tighter standards on it. So we're in the early stages of this. Newark, New Jersey is a city that already has one of these that we have looked at as a possible model. I'm hoping, at some future webinar, we can talk about all the success we've had with it, but it is still a gleam in the city's eye and the environmental justice's eye at the moment. We're also working with the city to design a truck electrification program that would be targeted to the neighborhoods with the worst truck-related pollution today. So I think that responds to what a lot of the people here are saying about the geographic scale of implementation and rollout programs is really important. So with the program that we are working on, there would be priority given in some way to trucks that are domiciled in the areas that are actually experiencing the worst air quality. We're in the design process of this now. So again, this is one where if anybody has tough questions about how we're going to do it, can't tell you yet. We are working with community groups and neighborhood groups and the city to design this program. There is funding for it, but we need to put the right program in place to make sure that funding goes to the places that need it and not the larger fleets that can more easily take advantage of these sorts of programs. We have to be very deliberate. So in all of these examples, this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll hold the rest of this for a later question, but it's really important to have the active engagement of the affected communities, because otherwise even well-meaning things that a state or a city or any kind of government tries to do, unless you have the community groups actively at the table co-designing that solution, it could really have unintended consequences.
Thank you. Yes, we're definitely going to come back to that. And though you didn't throw shade at California, I am going to turn to Roman, because you did highlight a great point, which is that all policies might not be transferable. They have to be locally adapted. And so, Roman, I do turn to you to speak to good examples or best practices from states or city programs. And California is a model state, and potentially how that could translate to other places.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And we'll take the shade. Sorry, Bob. And I completely agree, though, right? I think, to your point, some of the stuff that happens in California does not necessarily translate to others. I think, the way that Greenlining approaches this work is that we're hoping that we can take those lessons learned, right, and share that out, right, and build on that, right, because we know we don't always get it right as well here in California. So, and if we can share that with other states and then they can build on that, I think, then that's the path that we want to explore. But, I just want to make a couple of points here. I think, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at, both federal, regional, and local policy making, our focus is always about how we are making equity real and how we're operationalizing equity within it, right? How is equity being defined? How is it showing up in the process and the implementation and the evaluation, right? And only then can we really achieve, equity outcomes when it comes to these policies. And when we look at some of the state examples, right? Examples like the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, right? That passed a couple of years ago. The Advanced Clean Fleets rule that that California is currently working on, right? That came together and became really an equity or an environmental justice win because of the work of the community-based organizations that were part of that, right? Their engagement and their push to have the air resources do better on a policy was what made this a successful victory, right? And knowing that is long-term, right? Those are the long-term policies that we need in place to make sure that we're moving this sector in a way that is going to give us the vehicles, that we're going to see the transition from fleets to zero emission technology, right? However, all of that is at the state level. What we need is also those regional and local efforts, right? As Bob was talking about. When we talk about regional work, it's really pushing our air districts to do better as well and embedding equity into the policies that they're developing. Our local air districts would have their own air pollution reduction plans, right? How are they embedding equity and prioritizing community needs and priorities within it? And then, and that I think is a challenge on its own, right? And Bob could probably speak more because I know he has more information on that. But from my experience, what we've seen is that getting the air districts to really commit is, I think, has been extremely challenging, right? Even though they might have the data, even though there is the lived experiences from community members. And one of the things that I think has been really successful is, there's, here in California, there was these advisory committees that came together throughout the state to help develop, community emission reduction plans, right? What does it mean to have a bottom-up approach, right? And identify what those needs, what those priorities should be, and how they should be, how the regional and local agencies should be prioritizing, securing policies or funding. And I think that is one that I like to elevate and also caution about, right? Because they are advisory committees at the end of the day. The decision-making power is not always with the community members, it's still with the agency. And so how do we shift that? How do we make sure that if we are developing these community-driven processes, that we are also shifting the decision-making power to ensure that the community is able to identify how these policies should move forward. And, I hear a lot of agencies say that, yes, we want to shift the decision-making power, and then they don't do it, right? So we know it's a work in progress, but how are we holding them accountable to be able to do that? So we are seeing more effective than programs, right, that we see on the ground, so that we then see if states have incentive programs like here in California to transition trucks and buses, I'm sorry, just trucks, or both of them, but that they are prioritizing the communities that we want, that we know they're going to have the biggest impact, right? That we are seeing those direct benefits, right? That we're not just focused on indirect benefits, but we're seeing direct benefits. And at the end of the day, we're helping clean up and create healthier places to live.
Great, thank you. And so, Angelo, not to put you on the spot, but how do we shift decision-making power? How do we uplift community voices and ensure community participation, but done in such a way, as Ramon noted so well, the actual shift on power?
Yeah, I think, to the point of, one of the cornerstones of environmental justice is self-determination, right? That the folks on the front lines, folks that are directly impacted, have the solutions, right? They're the experts in their communities. So, making sure that we are not just engaging folks by checking off the box, but really engaging them, doing local, what we call democratizing planning, right? Like really from the planning stage all the way to implementation. Because we know anything about us without us is not for us, right? And so we need to make sure that we're including folks in the real decision-making, meaningful participation. And I would say, being from California and working with folks all across the country, the California thing is that, in the 70s and 80s, California was really conservative, right? And so just like, what's happening across the country, folks are organizing, folks are building local power, and then kind of making the connections to impact state power and then also national and international power. And so as we work towards that end about fostering local power building, connecting the dots to build a stronger movement globally, that we're going to make a lot more strides. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are really pushing an agenda that is about the basic human rights, being able to breathe clean air, being able to have good jobs, being able to have, decent housing. All these things are important that we need to make sure that we are truly advocating for, not just taking, bare minimums, but we need to have, all of our basic rights. We need it all: good jobs and clean air and decent housing. And so what we need to make sure we're doing is fostering that the local organizations and connecting the dots across the country. I wanted to touch on some of the points around what kind of rules should we have. I just wanted to make sure that I am, sharing the Moving Forward Networks campaign, which is Zero Emissions in Freight Now. I'm putting it in the chat, a link to our website. But one of the categories is the heavy duty trucks. And just like from our perspective on heavy duty trucks, we believe that we could both do the NOx and greenhouse rules in one rulemaking, rather than it being like over multiple rulemaking processes and or over multiple years. We can't wait any longer, right? Justice delayed is justice denied. And so we need to include that, because if we get to zero emission, right, we address both the greenhouse gas and the NOx emissions. But within the standard, we think that we can get to 100% EVs by 2035 for new vehicles, and that should be accompanied by a sales mandate that what correlates between the emission standards and the sales mandate, so that the consumer knows that there are vehicles available and the seller, the manufacturer, knows that there's a market for those vehicles. So we think it's really important to include a sales mandate as well as the emission standards. And again, making sure that we do that into one rulemaking so that it has an impact on the 2027 standards for heavy duty trucks and buses, rather than putting any part and piece of it off. Like, we can't wait to start to do the greenhouse gas standard down the road, right? We need to include that in today's standards.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that resource regarding your campaign. And so for those of you in the audience, I hope you click and read more about that. And something that you noted was how local organizing, and that ties to what Roman was saying, with local organizing has been responsible for a lot of the policies that we are seeing right now. And so the importance of that local organizing. And Bob, I turn back to you because you raised this point around needing community voice. And so how do we uplift community voices and ensure community participation in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of transportation pollution reduction strategies?
Yeah, so this overall concept is one of CNT's top just policy priorities at the moment. We're trying to make the argument that community-based organizations really need to be central partners in transportation decision-making. And when I say community-based organizations, this isn't necessarily about the transportation advocates who show up already and make their case. It's about involving environmental justice groups or nonprofits who are in the affordable housing space, or health service providers, or those who address homelessness. But really the point is that the organizations who work directly with marginalized groups should be at the table when transportation decisions are made. And in many cases, to be able to be there, the further place we take this is for them to be there and to actively participate, they need to be compensated. The common practice is for cities to spend millions on transportation consulting firms, but then ask a community organization to come to meetings and give their input for free. And our point is the input that you get from community groups is just as valuable or as what you get from consultants. So these people who are showing up and providing expertise compensated for their time and experience. But there's all kinds of barriers to this. Often the city's, let's say, transportation department staff might think that community compensation is a good idea, whether it's a gift card for meeting attendance or whether it's a stipend to a community group to help with an outreach process or data collection. So the transportation staff or the program staff can think, okay, this is worthwhile, but then it hits the procurement department or the budget office or the legal department and falls apart. That's partly because of rules in many cases the city itself has set, but it's even worse if there's federal money involved. And in the transportation space, there's always, almost always, some degree of federal money involved. So we have a coalition in Chicago that we've started up over the past about 2 years called the Transportation Equity Network, which is made up of around 40 nonprofit groups These mostly are community-based organizations who are not transportation specialists. And we've been engaging with the city, with the county, with regional transportation agencies to demonstrate that if you have these groups at the table and actually involve them in the plans and the projects that you're doing, you'll get better outcomes. So we're trying to prove the point that having this more involvement works. So that's a start. We also need changes at the federal level. We think it's all administrative stuff. It's nothing that requires legislation, but clarification that funding to community-based organizations is a legal way to use federal transportation money. And then at the local level, we need to convince cities and transit agencies and other governments to change their processes. And that point is important. It requires change by government. So often when I bring this up, you hear governments say they're going to build the capacity of community-based organizations to engage with them. But while that's well-intentioned, that's missing where the problem is. The problem isn't that community groups need training in how to fill out the government forms to make them appropriate contractors. It's that you, the government, need to change its own practices to remove the barriers to participation.
Thank you. And I want to re-emphasize that point about compensating people for their time. When we talk about the redistribution of wealth, we need to talk about compensating people for their time and what we give value to as expertise. So thank you for that. And in terms of redistribution of wealth, I turn to kind of a two-part question before opening it up to audience questions. Roman, I turn to you. How do we ensure that low-income and people of color from overburdened communities economically benefit and build community wealth from the transition to electric vehicles? How do environmental justice communities benefit with the transportation electrification supply chain?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And it's one that, we've been thinking a lot of, right? How do we ensure that, we're investing to build wealth, but then also to help improve the quality of life of our most impacted communities? So I think, this question really is all about intentionality, right? So taking that step back and really thinking about, again, what I've shared earlier of how we are operationalizing equity and making equity real within the policies and programs that we're developing, or that state agencies are developing, or the federal government, right? And really being intentional about how we're going to provide those direct and meaningful benefits to these communities, right? How are we going to ensure that we're investing without displacement, right? How are we going to make sure that we're greening and cleaning up our communities, that they are the ones who are benefiting from these investments? And we don't see, and we don't see where now, because these are greener communities, healthier places to live, that they are no longer to enjoy that, right? And others are enjoying instead of them. So I think, there's several points that I want to make here to this point, right? On how we can economically ensure that they're benefiting. When we think about, the deployment of this technology, right? Both from who's making, the zero emission trucks, right? To who's installing the charging infrastructure on the ground, right? We got to make sure that we're approaching this in a way that is creating those, that is providing those local benefits, right? That we are hiring folks from our local communities to be the ones who are installing or making these vehicles, so that we are allowing them to participate in this new green economy of ours, right? That they're the ones who are benefiting primarily because not only do they live in these communities, right? But they will stand to benefit a lot from that. So making sure that we're really intentional about that, right? And really setting up that for success. But in order to do that, again, it's all about being intentional and making sure that we're identifying that from the beginning, right? When we're defining what we're trying to accomplish here, we got to define what we mean by equity, but we also got to define who the target audience is, right? Where do we want to see benefits? Who we want to make sure is getting these jobs? Where should it be placed? All of that stuff needs to be defined from an early stage, because only then will you see the direct and intentional benefits to our most impacted communities. And then when we think about something that Angela said earlier, when we think about fleets and the drivers and all of that, we also really have to be conscious about that, right? Because some of these fleets, hire them as independent contractors and then pass on all these fees or costs to them. So how are we avoiding that, right? How do we make sure that we are not creating unintentional burdens on our independent contractors who might, or other drivers who come from our communities as we make this transition? And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we're identifying that early on and making sure that any type of funding that comes through is elevating that and addressing that so we don't run into these pitfalls where now we're creating undue burdens on our own communities because of the fact that we want to make this transition. But at the end of the day, I think, as I've said before, it's all really thinking about how we operationalize equity here and how we're really building into this from the bottom up, the community input, and making sure that, as Bob mentioned, we're compensating community members to participate, and not just for like, let's some short term. How are we investing long term, right? Because all of this is long term. And at times we see investment for like, oh yeah, we have this campaign, we need to really pass this this clean air plan, so we're going to engage communities. That's great, and we need to do more. How are our local cities, our state, our local agencies, and our state governments creating funding sources so that we're on the we're actively engaging community members throughout the process, building up their technical expertise, we're building up their capacity to be fully engaged, because we know this is long-term, this is a long-term game. So how are we doing that in a really effective way? And in that way, we're we're helping we reduce our pollution and reducing poverty in our low-income communities of color.
Thank you. Yes. And so you touched upon so many things, talking about where are we placing and who is placing EV charging infrastructure. You brought up issues around displacement and gentrification as we do greening, and these are now desirable places, making sure who gets to benefit from that. Talking about how do we build wealth and embedding equity from the beginning, as well as touching upon and intentionality. And so my last question that I open to you all before turning it to audience questions is, what are some potential unintended consequences? And though we say unintended, it's really unintended only when you're not planning, and as Ramon, you say so well, embedding equity. But when we don't embed equity, what kind of consequences could we get from transportation electrification? And I open this to you all.
If I can, I wanted to build off of Ramon's comments around where we're spending the resources and, making sure that we're not investing in companies and our projects that could have negative harms to communities. And one specific that I see it's happening quite a bit in terms of, let's just say unwilling partners have created this wedge around basically because of the conflation of zero emission vehicles and automation, kind of creating this wedge between, zero emission and clean air are jobs. So, I've heard, companies say, well, if we're going to electrify, we're going to automate. And so that means we're going to eliminate jobs. And so what do you want? Clean air or good jobs? And it doesn't have to be either or, right? That we know that it's not, that we don't have to conflate automation with zero emissions. So making sure that as we're, again, investing public dollars for public good, that we're not conflating zero emissions with automation, that, we're not going to invest in this industry that's going to displace, thousands of people in the workforce, that we have to look at this as a holistic approach. So jobs are included in that. And then I'd also mention that, through the investment for infrastructure, the administration has made a commitment to invest 40% of federal dollars into communities through the Justice 40 initiative, that we need to make sure that 60% isn't doing more harm, right? That we're not, building more lanes and more freeways and projects that are going to make, the environmental justice impacts even more severe, that we're not investing in projects like that, taking one step forward and two steps backwards. That we need to make sure that 40% is additive. It's not to kind of help to mitigate the 60%.
Great, thank you. And so now I'm going to open it. Oh, Bob, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I thought that question was for all of us. Sorry, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no, I thought the displacement point was very good that Roman had made too. Not exactly the same topic, but we did research recently on the installation of green stormwater infrastructure, so things like rain garden. And even something that small has small positive impacts on nearby property values. We were able to find that with a high degree of statistical significance. So they could contribute to gentrification and displacement in places that are already feeling that kind of pressure. And I feel like the installation of things like EV charging infrastructure could go in the same direction. the reason, the best we could tell, the reason they have that impact is largely because it's signaling, because it's sending a message about the public sector is making investments in this neighborhood, and therefore people want to invest here because they think it's going to be a place with property values that goes up. And that can be a concern. I mean, you see this already with things like bike lanes, for example. There are some communities that oppose the installation of bike lanes because there's not a lot of bike usage there today. And there's a question of who is this for? Is it for the people who are here now, or are you trying to replace us? And honestly, we have to treat that as a legitimate concern. So I think if EV chargers, for example, is just one piece of this, or put in neighborhoods where nobody has electric cars, you could see the raising of community concerns about like, who's this for? It's not for the people who are here now. So what is the long game here? So I think it's really important in these cases to build community support and understanding at the very early level of making interventions and actually involve people's decisions, and not just like drop in shiny new stuff into a neighborhood and expect people there to fix it.
May I?
Go ahead, Margaret.
So, thank you. I just want to say something to Angelo's point that the federal government should set a sale mandate for zero-emitting vehicles. Clearly, I believe that EPA doesn't need to do that. Especially, we don't need to try new creative legal ways to interpret the Clean Air Act, given the current courts. The Clean Air Act is, basically indicates that we need to set technology forcing standards. EPA has to consider cost, availability of technology, and by doing that, EPA can set those greenhouse gas standards at levels where one, zero-emitting technologies will compete better when it comes to cost, and it's going to be too expensive or even impossible for diesel to meet those levels. So just I want to make sure that, because I have heard that from many different groups, I'm not suggesting EPA should not explore sale mandates. We have never done it. There is not a precedent. There is currently a case that is moving forward in the Supreme Court that deals with the energy sector. I believe the Clean Air Act, the way it is for transportation, works very well to reduce, climate pollution from all the sources, including trucks, without necessarily having a sales mandate. As far as unintended consequences for electrification, one area that I would be concerned about is mining. US has significant resources, lithium and other materials that are needed for electric vehicles. We have seen in the past, in the history that still exists with mining around communities and the impacts that it has had. So sustainable mining will be an area that I would be very concerned about, and the impact to across the board, but most important to communities of low income and communities of color.
Thank you. And Julian, I do want to give you an opportunity for potential consequences, and then Angela, I'll bring it back to you to respond.
What comes to my mind is what Angelo mentioned early on, that there's many sources of pollution and of inequity, and we should think about transportation within the broader context. And so there's no one silver bullet. This is a very important source to focus on. When I think about electric vehicles, of course, the main thing I think about is, upstream. So we need to be cleaning our electricity grid also. You'd be looking at, and as Margaret mentioned, that includes mining, that includes, who lives near natural gas or coal, power plants, and so on, to look holistically at the solution.
Thank you. And Angela, I'll bring it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that both Margot and Julian had like really captured things that I was going to talk about in terms of unintended, which is the cradle to grave kind of like issues. So we're talking about, both the source of power or electricity to power the transportation system. So that's the making sure that our grid is 100% clean and sustainable, especially in EJ communities. Then the mining part is really critical, especially for First Nation folks, that we need to make sure that we're, really thinking about that now and setting up protections to make sure we're not doing additional harm. And then also the disposal of batteries as well as another major component to make sure that we're not just like kicking the burden to yet another community while we're trying to resolve this other one. And so all of those components from the cradle to grave kind of aspect is really important to consider as we're starting to roll out, so many different, EV programs.
Absolutely. And recently, the Biden administration announced its interest in developing a domestic lithium supply chain. And so what are the impacts of that going to be? And so thank you all for raising the issue around the full supply chain, particularly mining. And so now we have received so many great audience questions. And so I'm going to shift to those to get through as many as possible in the time that we have remaining. And so the first question, how effective would a cap and trade like the Transportation Climate Initiative be on reducing diesel emissions from heavy duty transportation? And I have an idea already on how some of you are going to respond, but I will leave that to you.
Well, if I could, go ahead, Margot, I was after you.
Go ahead, Angelo, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to start by saying the Moving Forward Network and its members are opposed to the Transportation Climate Initiative. That our position is that we have unintended consequences on EJ communities when you have market-based approaches. That when we're talking about a market-based approach, it really is about who's best positioned to take advantage of that market. And so our communities are typically not best positioned to take advantage of those programs. And so therefore we get the kind of like the result of that, which is basically like in the freight sector, in the port sector, warehouse and rail yard sector, that's where dirty trucks go to die. And so those folks have the least in terms of being able to take advantage of a market to, improve the situation. So we don't think that market-based approaches have a place or a role in getting to the point where we need to be. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use incentive dollars, but it shouldn't be based on a market approach from our perspective.
Thank you. Margot?
Yeah, and for reasons, Angela, I agree with your statements, but my question back to the question is why? We have looked at the cap and trade back when President Clinton was in office. And they moved forward the cap and trade program. But if you remember, there was that, as old as I am, the transportation sector was pulled out because it just doesn't work. What problem are we trying to fix? There is no problem that we can fix with cap and trade. We're going to cause many more problems. So again, the Clean Air Act as it is works very well to achieve the results that we're looking for.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add here is, and this is specifically related to the Transportation Climate Initiative, but just thinking about a cap and trade system, there's multiple studies out there already that have showcased how low-income communities of color are not benefiting, right, under market-based systems, right, and how we really need to pivot in our approaches to ensure that we're putting in systems that are prioritizing the needs and priorities of communities. So, if we already have multiple studies on this front showcasing that, then why continue to go down that path, right? When we know that we're not going to see the intended benefits, right, that we want in our communities.
Thank you. And Julian.
Just add one thing, which is because we hear a lot about co-benefits between climate and health, it's natural to think that they are always aligned, and they are often aligned, but not always. And diesel heavy-duty engines may be one example where they're not, where the steps you would take, if we're talking about climate and air pollution, the steps an engine manufacturer might take to reduce their climate impacts and make their engine more fuel efficient can actually worsen emissions of NOx. And so that just means if you're focused on one, it's not necessarily going to help the other. We need policies that do both.
Thank you. And so our next question is for another government approach. So do you think government purchase of electric vehicles, mass transit buses, school buses, mail trucks is a good way to clean the air and advance low carbon technology to universalize EVs for private heavy duty vehicles?
Yes, very important. Absolutely. And again, you know, I'm personally disappointed that the post office has decided not to follow the executive order that was put in place a few months ago, although it's an independent agency. That's very disappointing. But to answer the question, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'll double click on that. And, you know, it's purchasing and ensuring that the ones that they are getting and are prioritizing disadvantaged and low income communities, right? Whether that be the trucks, the buses, whatever vehicle it might be, the ones that are operating in our most impacted communities is the ones that where these vehicles should go first.
Great. Our next question, so expanding the conversation from just heavy duty trucks to other diesel engines, what would be the most desirable strategies to pursue for air pollution in other heavy duty diesel sectors, such as railroads and marine vessels?
So, you know, I put the link to our campaign in the chat. And so for folks that aren't familiar with our campaign, there's a letter attached on that website. And that letter is the letter that we're basing our campaign off that we sent to EPA in October of 2021. And it talks about the categories, both heavy duty, locomotive, marine vessel, and cargo handling equipment. And so we think that these kind of ratcheting down of standards and sales mandates is a really great combination. Following the request that we had around the 2035 deadline and then transitioning fully out, we believe that we can completely transition away from and retire combustion vehicles by 2045. And so we think that that's a really important component, coupled with a couple of other programs and incentives. We think that we can address all of those by, you know, get off of diesel internal combustion engines by 2045.
May I?
Marga?
Yes, so for marine, I think the biggest sources for marine are the ocean-going vessels, and we have seen the pollution that have created in Los Angeles ports. My understanding currently, and Europe is ahead of the US, actually there is a company called Maersk, which is a large container company. Green hydrogen is probably one of the best technologies for ocean-going vessels. And what I mean by green hydrogen, I don't mean hydrogen from natural gas. I mean hydrogen that is produced from renewable sources. Also, EPA has the authority for locomotive engines and marine engines. And potentially for locomotive electrification may be a way to go, because already there's a heavy electrification when you look at locomotive engines.
Great, thank you. And again, thank you for uplifting the campaign that Moving Forward Network has done. So audience, I encourage you to click the link. Next, we take it to kind of that multiple levels of government. And so what are the next steps for remediating the gaps in defining environmental justice communities between state and federal programs?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. So what are the steps for remediating the gaps? So earlier we talked about how there's so many different names: environmental justice, disadvantage, overburden, and how we're allocating federal funding and how it's influencing programs. And so what are the steps for remediating the gaps in defining environmental justice communities between state and federal programs?
I would just say that, you know, one of MFN's campaign objectives is around an indirect source rule. We believe that the federal government, or US EPA, has the authority to implement indirect source rule where states or local regions don't want to do, incorporate that type of rulemaking. And those get at some of the operations of facilities like warehousing, our rail yards, our ports, where rules for the actual vehicle or the equipment aren't actually getting to the local benefits. So that's one strategy. And again, we believe that under the Clean Air Act, that the EPA does have the authority to implement those rules if the state doesn't want to. More details also on that in our letter.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'll take a shot at what I think it means, which is, or just respond to it. that think it's helpful to have federal standards, but sometimes you also need the ability of local or states to set their own priorities for what is the right way to define environmental justice there. You know, in some parts of the country, for example, mining of, let's say, uranium or lithium or something is a huge thing and is an enormous environmental justice concern. It's not in Chicago. And so for some communities, truck traffic is a huge concern, but it's not in others. So I don't really see that there's ever going to be one perfect way of doing this at the federal level. When the federal government has ever tried to do anything that's like one rule for the entire country, all of its different landscapes. It's hard to implement that because people have their own priorities locally about what's really an issue. So I would say that maybe bringing this together and fully getting rid of those gaps might not be the goal. It might be to have a baseline that's set by the federal government, but then the ability of states or local governments to go beyond that and identify specific environmental justice priorities that they also want to make be a focus.
Thank you. That brings to mind a lot that's going on with the climate and economic screening tool. That's this federal tool. And so listening to a talk with Dr. Sokobi Wilson, he mentioned how there's been a lot of emphasis on that. However, what about having state tools? Each state should have a tool because, as you said, Bob, each state has different priorities. And then even within the state, there's different priorities. And so this emphasis at this national level could be for a baseline, but then what are states going to develop to ensure that the priorities reflect the needs of the communities of that state? And so thank you for that. Anyone else?
I think you need both. You need, for example, let's talk about the diesel truck proposal that EPA is coming soon. To the extent that they're going to set very ambitious standards for zero-emitting vehicles, the industry is going to develop the technology. The costs are going to come down across the board. Then you can have local and state incentives to move forward, to provide incentives, flexibilities, requirements. So these communities that are served by this, the current very dirty, polluted vehicles can switch to zero-emitting vehicles. So you need all these strategies. It's not just one way. You just don't need the local government or the state government or the federal government. You need everybody to be working in tandem to achieve zero emissions across the board, especially where the priority is right now, which is the communities of color and low-income communities.
Absolutely, a multi-pronged strategy. And Roman?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll double click on a lot of what's already been said. The only thing I'll just add is that, even about just thinking about that baseline, a federal baseline, right, that we want, it also can't be too broad, right, of a baseline, because then, then you have, communities that necessarily, could potentially be prioritizing communities that should not be prioritized through the state funding, right, through this federal funding. So how do we create a baseline that is, somewhat focused, that then allows state and local governments to take that further, right? To really uplift to what Bob was saying about those local needs, right? And that playing into defining where we should be investing. And this all goes back to really being intentional about making equity real, right? And I know I've said that several times now, but it's really on the federal government to think about how, what its equity definition and who its intended audience is. And through that, then be able to define a baseline that will then allow for state governments to build upon on those local needs, right? So I think it's an iterative process, but the baseline itself at the high level can't be too broad, where then you have too much wiggle room that won't then prioritize our most impacted and frontline communities.
That is such a great point to transition to our kind of conclusion on, is how is the government defining and operationalizing equity? And this is for transportation and in all of its policies to, as Angelo mentioned, ensure that the 60% of investments are not doing more harm than the 40%. And so how is the federal government defining equity? And so with that, before we end, I will ask each of you to give a short, about 30-second closing remark. What would be your final words, or what would you want to our audience to leave with on this issue of transportation pollution and heavy-duty trucks? And I will start with Julian. Or should I not? Okay, I can start somewhere else. Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Okay, great.
So to just summarize, diesel trucks, medium and heavy duty trucks, cause at least 50 and more emissions for NOx in particular. We know that NOx and particulate emissions are concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities. So having a federal program that EPA is going to propose pretty soon to address NOx, PM, but also greenhouse gases is very crucial. The technology is there that will allow us to zero the emissions from diesel, medium, and heavy-duty diesel trucks. Furthermore, I believe that there are resources that Congress can make available, federal government, state government, to replace the most polluting vehicles in ports, freeways, urban delivery vehicles that affect mostly the communities. The technology is here, we can do it.
Great. Who wants to go? I'll turn it to Bob.
Okay. Yeah, there was a question we didn't get to that I'll fold in here too about if the lack of hyperlocal data on air quality is hindering us. And I'm going to mention that and also bring that into the other points I was making that, yeah, I mean, it is. And I think there's a huge role here in many ways for community groups to get engaged in both collecting the data that describes what problems they're facing and analyzing that data, and then being part of coming up with solutions. I mean, you need to have a local perspective and involvement, or you will end up with outcomes that you don't expect.
Thank you. And next I turn to Angela.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one, I just want to say, like, the urgency around this is, it just can't emphasize how fast and how much we need to do to resolve the issues that we're facing, not just the environmental racism issues, but the climate crisis that we're trying to resolve. So we need to do more, and we need to do more faster, and we need to make sure that we're focusing in on the EJ communities. And it really isn't about whether it's feasible or we have the technology. We know we can do that. It's an engineering feat. It's a program, project. I mean, over 20 years ago, we sent our first robot to Mars, and since then we sent several others. If we can send a robot to Mars, I'm sure we can figure out how to resolve this issue and make sure that we do it within a very fast time frame.
Thank you. Julian?
So I would say when we look at the long-term arc of air pollution, things have gotten better over time. Again, we've seen structural inequalities that are overlaid on those improvements. And while I agree completely with what Angelo said, that we need to act now, we also need to enact legislation that has a long-term view that will work to ensure the solutions carry forth, and extend well beyond this one administration or the next administration beyond that.
Thank you. And the last word goes to you, Armand.
All right. Well, I just want to wrap this up by one saying thank you to everyone for sharing your insights. It's been really, it's always really uplifting to be in the space with such amazing experts. And I'll just close by saying that, I think when we think about data and the impact of data, right, I think just, quantitative data is definitely important and we need that. But qualitative data is just as important. And we need to make sure that as we're developing these federal policies or state or local policies, that we're adding, as much or more weight, right, to qualitative data, because our community's lived experience it weighs a lot more than that quantitative data. And that will help us expedite a lot of these processes because the urgency is there, right, as Angelo mentioned. And I think, when we, at the end of the day, we must look at this from, an intersectionality approach, right? We can't look at it through a single lens because we know that, yes, we need to move this sector. Yes, we need to ensure that we're transitioning zero emission vehicles, that we're moving our trucks, buses, and medium to heavy duty to zero emission. But again, this is intersectional, and that is only a component of the lived experiences of our communities. And in order to really address all the issues, we need to look at it through that lens and the impact that it has across the board. So, thank you.
Thank you. What a great way to conclude this session. Thank you all. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists for all of your great perspective and points that you made today. And with that, I will turn it back now to Anastasia, Energy and Transportation Policy Manager at WEACT. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a great discussion. On behalf of WEACT, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and a special thank you to Dr. Patterson for moderating this important conversation. Thank you all for coming. Please make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at WEACT4EJ. And thank you all. Have a good afternoon or good morning. Bye.